When he reached the auditorium, he hesitated for a moment at the door. He looked around to make sure no one was nearby, then quietly stepped inside. The piano was still there, sitting under the dim light, waiting. He brushed off some dust and opened the lid again. His hands hovered over the keys. This time, when he began to play, it came easier. His fingers moved more smoothly and the melody flowed like water. He played softly at first, afraid someone might hear, but the sound was too beautiful to stop. The notes filled the air, blending with the faint hum of the lights. He played one song, then another. The music carried him back through time, to his younger days when he believed he might have a future on a stage instead of behind a broom. It wasn't about the audience anymore. It wasn't about applause or recognition. It was about the feeling, the way music could speak when words couldn't. As he played, he didn't notice that the auditorium door wasn't fully closed. It was slightly ajar, just enough for sound to slip through. In the hallway, a student named Mia had stayed late that night. She was part of the drama club and had been working on a set design for an upcoming play. When she passed the auditorium, she stopped. The faint sound of a piano reached her ears, gentle, emotional, alive. She leaned closer to the door. It wasn't the kind of music she expected to hear at school, especially not this late. The notes were slow and heartfelt, played by someone who clearly understood more than just technique. Whoever it was, they weren't just playing a song, they were telling a story. Mia listened quietly, her heart warming at the sound. When the music stopped, she peeked through the small glass window in the door. Her eyes widened in surprise when she saw who was sitting at the piano. It wasn't a music teacher or one of the students, it was the janitor. For a moment, she stood there, not knowing what to think. She had seen him before, pushing his mop through the hallways, silent and unnoticed. She had never even heard him speak. And yet here he was, playing the piano like someone who had lived and breathed music all his life. She didn't want to interrupt, so she quietly stepped away. But she couldn't stop thinking about what she had just witnessed. The next day, she told her friend during lunch. "I swear it was him," she said, her voice low but excited. "The janitor. He was in the auditorium playing the piano. And he was really good, like, really good." Her friend laughed. "You mean Harold? No way. He probably just hit a few keys while cleaning." "I'm serious," Mia said, shaking her head. "It wasn't just noise. It was music. Real music." Word spread faster than she expected. By the end of the day, a few teachers had heard the rumor too. Some brushed it off, others were curious. One of the assistant principals decided to check the security footage just to see what was going on. When they saw the video, grainy, black and white footage of Harold sitting at the piano, playing softly, they didn't know what to say. The principal, a kind but practical woman, leaned back in her chair and smiled. "Well," she said, "I guess we have a very talented janitor." That evening, when Harold arrived for work, he noticed a few teachers looking at him differently. They smiled more warmly, greeted him by name, and even asked how his night was going. It made him a little uneasy. He wasn't used to being noticed. He had no idea that people had seen the video. By the time he reached the auditorium, he could feel his hands trembling. He wasn't sure if he should play again. What if someone was waiting to catch him? What if he got in trouble for using school property after hours? He didn't want to lose his job. He told himself to forget about the piano and focus on work. But as he passed by, he couldn't help glancing inside. The stage light was on again, casting that familiar soft glow. The piano seemed to be calling him, quiet but persistent. He sighed. "Just a few minutes," he whispered to himself. He stepped onto the stage and sat down. This time he played a lighter tune, something cheerful and full of rhythm. The sound echoed and his worries faded. He didn't notice the footsteps in the back of the room until he finished the song. When he turned around, the principal was standing near the door, smiling gently. For a moment, he froze. I'm sorry," he stammered. "I was just checking the piano, ma'am. It's been here a while and—" She raised her hand to stop him. "It's all right, Harold. I've seen the footage." He blinked, unsure what she meant. "The security cameras," she said kindly. "We saw you playing. You don't have to apologize. That was beautiful." Harold didn't know what to say. His face grew warm. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble," he said quietly. Sometimes I play when it's quiet. Helps pass the time." "You have real talent," she said, stepping closer. "Do you mind if I ask, how long have you been playing?" He hesitated. "Since I was a boy," he said. "I used to dream of being a musician once. But life had other plans." The principal nodded with understanding. "Well, I think you should play more often," she said. "In fact, I'd like to ask you a favor. Would you be willing to perform at our next school assembly?" Harold looked at her as if she'd just spoken another language. "Perform?" he repeated. "Oh no, I couldn't. I'm just the janitor. Nobody wants to hear me play." "I think you'd be surprised," she said with a smile. "People could use a bit of inspiration these days. And I think your story would mean something to them." He wanted to say no, but the kindness in her eyes made it hard. "I'll think about it," he said finally. "Good," she replied. "And Harold, thank you for reminding us that talent can be found anywhere." She left him alone in the auditorium, still sitting at the piano, unsure how to feel. That night, as he continued his rounds, the thought of performing made him nervous. He hadn't played for an audience in decades. What if he messed up? What if the students laughed? But beneath the fear there was something else. A small flicker of excitement he hadn't felt in years. The next few nights, he practiced in secret. He played soft songs, loud ones, old ones he remembered from his youth. Each time he grew a little more confident. The piano's sound filled the empty school like a heartbeat. Sometimes when he played late into the night, he imagined what it would be like to share that music again, to remind people that even the quietest among them might have something beautiful to offer. He didn't know that. Outside the auditorium doors, students were starting to gather in small groups just to listen. They didn't go inside. They just stood in the hallway, letting the music drift out to them. It became a quiet tradition no one told him. They wanted to keep it their secret, and so, while Harold thought he was playing for no one, he was, in truth, reaching hearts he didn't even know were listening. The man who had spent so many years unseen was slowly beginning to be heard. The following Monday, the school felt different. The same students rushed through the same halls. The same teachers hurried to their classes, and the same old clock ticked above the front office. But beneath it all there was a quiet buzz. Whispers, glances, and smiles that seemed to follow Harold wherever he went. For years, people had passed him like he was part of the walls. Now they greeted him. "Good morning," one student said as she hurried by. "Hey, you were amazing on Friday." Another shouted from down the hall. A few even stopped to shake his hand or thank him. Some just smiled. At first, it made him uncomfortable. He wasn't used to so much attention. He had lived most of his life in the background, quiet and unseen. Now all of a sudden, people were noticing him. He didn't quite know how to handle it. In the teacher's lounge, a few staff members clapped when he walked in to empty the trash. Someone had even left a small box of cookies on his cart with a note that said, "For the man who brought music back to our halls." He smiled at that. Not because of the cookies, though they were good, but because of the words. Brought music back. He had never thought of it that way. He had only been doing what made him feel alive. Later that day, while he was sweeping near the main office, the principal stepped out of her room. "Harold," she called, "can I see you for a moment?" He nodded and followed her inside. She smiled as she gestured for him to sit. "I've had teachers and students coming to me all weekend, telling me how much they loved your performance. You really made an impression." He rubbed his hands together nervously. "I just played a few notes," he said quietly. "Didn't think it'd be such a big deal." "It was more than that," she said. "It was a reminder that everyone here has a story, and yours touched people." He didn't know how to respond. Compliments weren't something he heard often. "I was thinking," she continued, "maybe you could play again. Not right away, but perhaps once a month. Maybe even teach a few interested students in the afternoons." "Teach," he repeated, almost laughing. "Me? I don't even have a music degree. I just play by ear." "That's exactly why you'd be good at it," she said. "Some of our students don't connect with formal lessons. But if they see someone like you, someone who learned from life, not textbooks, and it might inspire them." He looked down at his hands. They were rough from years of work, scarred from lifting buckets and scrubbing floors. Could these same hands really teach someone about music? "I'll think about it," he said softly. She smiled. "That's all I ask." For the rest of the day, he couldn't stop thinking about her offer. Teach? The idea scared him as much as it excited him. He wasn't sure anyone could learn anything from him. Still, he liked the thought of sharing music again. That evening, after the school emptied out, he walked into the auditorium. The piano waited for him as always, shining faintly under the single light. He sat down and began to play a slow, thoughtful tune. It wasn't one he had practiced before. It came to him naturally, as if his hands were telling a story his mouth couldn't, a story of second chances. When he finished, he sat for a long while staring at the keys. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. The next week, he told the principal yes, it started small. A few curious students stayed after class one afternoon to see if the rumor was true, that the janitor was giving music lessons. He expected them to laugh or lose interest quickly. Instead, they stayed. He showed them how to find middle C, how to listen for the difference between major and minor notes, how to feel rhythm instead of counting it. His way of teaching wasn't polished, but it was real. He talked about how music had been his escape when life got hard, how it gave him a reason to keep going when everything else seemed heavy. The students listened closely. Some came back the next day and the day after that. Within a month, a small group gathered around the piano every Thursday evening. They brought their own notebooks and tried to copy the songs he played. Sometimes they laughed when they made mistakes, and he laughed with them. Other times, they just listened quietly while he played, soaking in the music. For the first time in a long time, the school didn't feel like just a workplace. It felt alive. One afternoon, as he was cleaning the cafeteria, one of the students from his group stopped by. She handed him a folded paper. "We wrote you something," she said shyly. When he opened it later, it was a short note that read, "Thank you for reminding us that dreams don't have to end. They just wait." He stared at those words for a long time. They made something inside him ache, but in a good way. He kept that note in his locker from then on. As the weeks went by, more people started coming to listen. Sometimes teachers would peek in during his lessons. Sometimes parents, waiting to pick up their children, would hear the music through the open door and smile. The school began calling his little sessions Music with Harold. It wasn't official, but it stuck. Despite all the attention, he stayed humble. He still swept the floors, emptied the bins, and polished the windows. But now, every time he passed a student in the hall, someone would nod or wave. He wasn't invisible anymore. One Friday evening, after his group left, he sat alone at the piano again. He thought about everything that had happened in the past month. How a simple tune had changed the way people saw him, and how he saw himself. He remembered his younger days, when he used to play in a small cafe on weekends. Back then, he had believed he could make a living with music. But life had other plans: bills, family, responsibility. He had traded dreams for survival, like so many others. Yet here he was, decades later, finding that dream again. He started to play softly, the melody calm and peaceful. Halfway through, he felt a tear roll down his cheek. Not out of sadness, but gratitude. Life had brought him full circle in a way he never expected. Just then, the auditorium door opened. It was the principal again, carrying a camera. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said. He smiled faintly. "Not at all. I have a surprise," she said. "The school board wants to feature you in our monthly newsletter. They're really proud of what you're doing." He froze. "Me, why?" "I'm just—" "Don't say just," she interrupted gently. "You've brought life into this place. People need stories like yours." She lifted the camera. "May I take a photo?" "You don't have to pose, just keep playing." He chuckled. "All right, but don't blame me if I blink." She laughed and he began to play again while she snapped a few pictures. When she left, he sat for a while, letting the weight of it sink in. For so long, he had been afraid to be seen. Now the thought of sharing his story didn't scare him anymore. That night, as he was leaving, he noticed something taped to the bulletin board near the main entrance. A flyer with a picture of him at the piano. The headline read, "Music finds its way back. Crestview's janitor inspires students through song." He stood there, staring at it, unsure whether to laugh or cry. When students passed by the next morning, they pointed and smiled. "That's you," one said proudly. He just nodded, embarrassed but happy. Over the next few weeks, people from outside the school began to hear about him. A local reporter called asking for an interview. A nearby community center invited him to come play for their youth program. He didn't accept right away. He wanted to stay humble, to keep things simple. But deep down, he knew something had changed forever. The piano that had gathered dust for years was now the heart of the school. And he, the man everyone once passed without seeing, had become part of something bigger than himself. That evening, as he walked home under the golden streetlights, he thought about how life had surprised him. He had never imagined that one quiet night sitting down at an old piano would lead to all of this. He smiled as he looked up at the dark sky. Sometimes, he thought, life doesn't give up on you. It just waits for the right moment to remind you who you are. He reached his apartment, hung up his jacket, and sat by the window with a cup of tea. The city lights shimmered below. In his small living room, his old second-hand piano sat waiting, the same one he had bought years ago when money was tight. He walked over, lifted the cover, and pressed a single key. The note rang out, warm and familiar. "Still sounds good," he whispered. Then he smiled, not the tired, quiet smile of a janitor, but the soft, proud smile of a man who had found his song again. The following week started like any other, but there was something different in the air. The moment Harold stepped into the school, he could feel it. Students smiled when they saw him, teachers greeted him warmly, and a few even stopped just to chat. He wasn't used to that kind of attention, but he had to admit, it felt good. The piano lessons had become a regular thing now. Every Thursday afternoon, a small crowd gathered in the auditorium. Some came to learn, others just to listen. Even those who didn't care much for music seemed drawn to the calm and happiness that filled the room whenever he played. That day, the principal stopped by while the students were warming up. She leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching quietly. Harold noticed her but didn't say anything. He wanted the kids to focus. He was teaching them a simple melody that could be played with one hand. It wasn't fancy, but it made them feel proud. When the class ended, the principal walked up to him with a smile. "You've really created something special here," she said. He chuckled softly. "They're the ones doing the work. I just show them where the notes are." "Still," she said, "you're the reason they show up." She handed him an envelope. "The local community center is hosting a small charity event next weekend. They asked if you'd be willing to play a few pieces. Nothing fancy, just something to lift people's spirits." He blinked. "Me in front of strangers?" She nodded. "Yes, you. They heard about your story from the newsletter. You've inspired people, Harold. This could be something wonderful." He looked down at the envelope for a long time. He hadn't played for a crowd outside the school in years, decades really. The thought made his stomach twist, but deep down, he knew he couldn't say no. "I'll think about it," he said. That night, after cleaning the hallways and stacking the last set of chairs, he sat in the empty auditorium. The piano waited for him like an old friend. He opened the envelope again, reading the letter slowly under the soft stage light. It was simple, a polite invitation from the community center director saying they'd be honored to have him perform. They were raising money for local families who had fallen on hard times. He thought about that for a moment. Helping others through music. It felt right. He placed the letter on the piano and began to play. The melody that came out was gentle and full of hope. He imagined it echoing through the community hall, reaching people who needed a bit of light in their lives. By the time he stopped, his decision was made. He would do it. The next few days, he practiced after work. Sometimes students stayed behind to listen, offering small suggestions or cheering him on. "You're going to be great," one of them said before running off. On the evening of the performance, he stood in front of the mirror in his small apartment, adjusting his only clean dress shirt. It was a little tight around the shoulders, but it would do. He ran a comb through his hair, took a deep breath, and told himself it was just another night at the piano. When he arrived at the community center, the place was already buzzing with people. Families, kids, and seniors filled the seats. The walls were decorated with simple lights, and the smell of coffee and cookies filled the air. A woman from the staff met him at the door. "You must be Harold," she said warmly. "We're so happy you're here." "Everyone's been talking about you." He smiled awkwardly. "I'm not used to all this attention," he admitted. She laughed softly. "Well, get used to it tonight." The stage was small with an upright piano sitting in the middle. As he walked toward it, he could feel dozens of eyes following him. He placed his hands on the keys, his fingers trembling slightly. For a moment, he thought he might forget everything he'd practiced. Then he closed his eyes and let the first note ring out. The sound filled the hall, pure and steady. As he played, the noise of the room faded away. His hands moved with confidence, guided by memory and feeling rather than thought. The melody was slow at first, then built up, warm and hopeful like a story unfolding through sound. When he finished the first piece, the crowd clapped. Some even stood. He looked out and saw smiling faces everywhere. For the first time in years, he felt completely alive. He played 3 more songs that night, each one with a story behind it. Between pieces, he spoke a little, sharing bits of his past, how he used to play when he was younger, how life had pulled him away from it, and how he found his way back by accident. He didn't mean to get emotional, but his voice cracked at one point when he said, "I thought music was gone from my life. But sometimes things we lose have a way of finding us again." The audience went silent for a few seconds, and then came another round of applause, louder, warmer, almost like a hug, after the show. People came up to thank him. Some said his music made them think of their own childhood dreams. Others said it gave them hope. One man even said, "You reminded me that it's never too late to start again." Harold smiled at each of them, humbled and a little overwhelmed. On his way out, the community center director caught up with him. "You have a gift," she said. "We'd love to have you come back and teach some of our kids. Many of them can't afford lessons, and you'd be the perfect person to inspire them." He hesitated, feeling that familiar tug of doubt again. "I don't know," he said. "I'm just an old janitor who likes to play." She shook her head. "You're more than that. You're proof that passion doesn't fade, it waits." He didn't say yes right away, but the thought stayed with him all the way home. That night, lying in bed, he stared at the ceiling. The applause, the smiles, the kind words, they all replayed in his head. Maybe this was his second chance. Maybe music wasn't something that belonged in the past. The next morning, he arrived at the school early, just as the sun began to rise. The halls were quiet and golden in the soft light. He stopped by the auditorium before starting his cleaning rounds. The piano sat there, gleaming faintly in the morning glow. He sat down and played the same piece he had performed the night before. It sounded different in the empty room, more personal, more peaceful. When the last note faded, he whispered, "Thank you." Over the next few weeks, word spread about his community center performance. More students joined his lessons, and the principal arranged for him to play at the school's upcoming spring event. It wasn't a concert this time. It was a full evening dedicated to music and storytelling. When the day came, the auditorium was packed. Parents filled the seats, teachers stood in the back, and students lined the walls. The lights dimmed, and Harold walked onto the stage, dressed in the same shirt he'd worn at the charity event. This time, though, he wasn't nervous. He smiled, bowed slightly, and began to play. The first song was the one that started it all, the soft melody he had played that night when he first touched the dusty piano keys. As soon as the notes filled the room, a hush fell over the audience. It was like time stopped. When the last chord rang out, the applause was thunderous. He looked out and saw tears in the eyes of teachers who had worked beside him for years without ever really knowing him. Students stood cheering, some waving their hands in the air. After the show, people surrounded him again, thanking him for his music. But this time something was different. He didn't feel small or out of place. He felt seen. That night, walking home under the streetlights, he thought about everything that had changed. He was still the janitor. He still cleaned floors, emptied bins, and mopped hallways. But now he was also something else. A teacher. A musician. A man who had brought music back to a place that didn't even realize it was missing. He smiled to himself, carrying his worn-out piano sheet in one hand and his keys in the other. Maybe life wasn't about starting over. Maybe it was about continuing, finding the beauty in where you are, even if it's not where you thought you'd be. As he turned the corner toward his building, he could almost hear the piano again, playing softly in the back of his mind. The same song that started it all. And for the first time in a long while, Harold didn't feel like someone who had been forgotten by life. He felt like someone who had finally come home. The months that followed were some of the happiest Harold had known in years. The school halls that once felt silent and lonely now carried warmth and laughter. Music drifted through the corridors almost every afternoon, not just from him but from the students he had taught. Some learned fast, others struggled, but each of them played with heart. The old piano in the auditorium had become a symbol. Students decorated it with paper stars and little notes that said things like "Keep Dreaming" and "Music Lives." Here, the janitor who once swept floors quietly in the background was now the soul of the schools. Heartbeat. Harold still did his janitorial work, of course. He never stopped cleaning the classrooms, fixing broken chairs, or polishing windows until they shone. He didn't want special treatment. The piano and the mop, both were parts of who he was now. One kept the school shining on the outside, the other kept it glowing on the inside. One Thursday afternoon, as the students gathered for their usual piano lesson, a young boy hesitated by the door. Harold noticed him standing there with a small notebook clutched tightly in his hands. "You can come in," Harold said kindly. "No one bites here." The boy stepped forward shyly. "I don't play," he murmured, "but I write songs. I was wondering if maybe you could help me make them sound like real music." Harold's eyes softened. "Of course. Bring your notebook." The boy opened the pages, showing scribbled lyrics full of emotion and honesty. Harold read a few lines and smiled. "These are good," he said. "Let's give them a voice." Together they spent the afternoon turning the boy's words into melody. When the final note rang out, the boy looked amazed, like he had just seen a dream come alive. That moment reminded Harold why he had said yes to teaching in the first place. It wasn't about being in the spotlight. It was about seeing others discover something inside themselves, something that made them feel alive. As weeks turned into months, more students came to him for help. Some wanted to learn to play. Others brought their own songs or poems. Slowly, the lessons turned into small gatherings of creativity and joy. The school even started calling it the music room, even though it was still the same old auditorium with dusty curtains and squeaky seats. Then one morning, the principal called Harold into her office again. He walked in with his cleaning cloth still in his hand, wondering if something was wrong. "I have some news," she said with a wide smile. "The local newspaper wants to do a follow-up story on you. They said your last performance at the community center inspired people. They even called you the janitor who brought back the music." Harold laughed softly. "That's a funny title." "It's a beautiful one," she replied. "They also want to invite you to a city event next month, a celebration of local heroes." "You'd perform there?" He blinked in disbelief. "Local heroes? I don't think I fit that title." She smiled gently. "You do more than you realize, Harold. You've changed this place. You've changed people." He didn't answer right away. He just nodded, quietly moved. When he left her office, he walked down the hallway, thinking about how far things had come. He remembered his first nights working there, when he'd mopped the floors alone while hearing the faint echoes of laughter from faraway classrooms. Back then, no one even noticed him. Now, that same hallway was filled with greetings, laughter, and the sound of music playing from somewhere down the corridor. That night, after everyone had gone home, he stayed in the auditorium again. The piano keys glowed under the stage light, waiting for his touch. He sat down and started to play slowly, gently, the same tune that had started it all months ago. But this time, something was different. The notes felt lighter, freer, like the music wasn't coming from him anymore, but from the life around him, from the kids, from the laughter, from the hope that had filled the school. Halfway through his playing, he heard a soft creak behind him. Someone had opened the door. It was the principal. She smiled and stepped inside. "You're still here?" He nodded. Couldn't leave without saying goodnight to the piano. She walked closer. "You know," she said, "they've been talking about naming the auditorium after you." He looked up, startled. "What? No, that's not necessary." She interrupted him gently. "Don't say just, you've earned it." He looked down at the keys, his fingers resting on them. "I never wanted recognition," he said softly. "I just wanted to play again," she smiled. "And that's exactly why you deserve it." A few weeks later, the big city event finally arrived. Harold stood backstage, feeling the familiar mix of nerves and excitement. The auditorium was much larger than the school's, with bright lights and a crowd of hundreds. When they called his name, he stepped forward slowly. The applause that followed was warm and kind. He sat down at the grand piano, far fancier than the one he was used to, and placed his hands on the keys. Before playing, he spoke softly into the microphone. "I used to think dreams had an expiration date," he said, "that if you didn't chase them young, they slipped away forever. But I learned something. Sometimes dreams don't disappear. They just wait quietly until you're ready to listen again." Then he began to play. The melody filled the hall, gentle, full of life, and deeply human. It spoke of quiet nights, hard work, second chances, and the simple beauty of rediscovering yourself. People listened in complete silence. Some closed their eyes. Some held hands. When the final note faded, the crowd rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, whistling. He stood slowly and gave a small bow, his heart full. He hadn't played for fame. He had played to share a piece of himself, and to remind others that it's never too late to begin again. After the event, people came up to talk to him. Some thanked him for his words. A few parents said they wanted to bring their children to his lessons. Others told him how his story had inspired them to dust off their old guitars, notebooks, or paints. As he walked out into the cool evening air, he felt lighter than he had in years. The sky was filled with stars, and somewhere in the distance, he could still hear faint music from the hall behind him. Back at school, life continued as usual. Harold still cleaned, still played, still taught. But one afternoon something happened that made him pause. He was walking through the corridor when he heard music coming from the auditorium. But it wasn't him playing. It was one of his students practicing the same song he had played that first night so long ago. He stood quietly outside the door, listening. The notes were a little uneven, a little unsure, but full of heart. And that was enough to make him smile. He realized in that moment that the music would continue even when he wasn't around. It would live through them, through the students who had found confidence, hope, and joy in those dusty piano keys. That thought filled him with peace. Months later, on his last day before retirement, the school surprised him with a small ceremony. Students, teachers, and parents gathered in the auditorium. The same piano he had played all those nights now sat in the center, freshly polished. The principal stepped onto the stage and smiled at him. For years, this man swept our halls, fixed our chairs, and kept our school running. But he did something far greater. He reminded us of the power of music, and of how one person can bring light just by following their heart. The crowd clapped as she pulled the cover off a small plaque on the wall. It read, "The Harold Thompson Auditorium, where music found its way back." He stood there, speechless, his eyes wet. The students cheered, chanting his name. Some of them even started playing a little tune on the piano, the same melody he had once played alone. He laughed through his tears. All right, he said, wiping his face. "You're going to make an old man cry on his last day." Later that evening, when everyone had left, he stayed behind for one final song. He sat at the piano, touched the keys, and whispered, "Thank you for everything." The notes drifted softly into the empty hall. It was peaceful, gentle, like a goodbye whispered through music. When he finished, he closed the lid slowly and stood. He took one last look at the room that had given him his second chance. Then he turned off the lights and walked out. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in gold and pink. The air was cool and quiet. He took a deep breath, smiled, and began to walk home. As he passed the school gates, he heard something faint, the sound of the piano playing again. One of the students had come back, practicing long after everyone else had gone. He stopped and listened. The melody was familiar, his melody. And in that moment, Harold knew his story wasn't ending at all. It was only beginning again, through every note, every dream, every young hand that touched those keys. He kept walking, the sound fading behind him, his heart full and light. The janitor who once swept the floors had left behind something far greater than clean halls. He had left behind a song, one that would never stop playing.